Mystery Historians, and welcome to lesson 2 of our Victorian Mysteries topic. This lesson is going to be focused on resurrection men and body snatchers. So we've got two learning intentions that you can see there that we're looking at. One of which is that we want to be able to explain what resurrection men actually were and what people did to try and fight against them, so the methods that other people used to stop these resurrection men in whatever they were doing. And the second learning intention is to explain the impact that Burke and Hare's crimes, which we'll look at in more detail, actually had on what we would consider today as modern medicine. So with that thought in mind, a kind of quick sort of starter discussion point that you can have just to think by yourself, or if you really want to and you're being really super keen, you can maybe chat to someone at home about it. But the question that we're thinking about is, do you think that good can sometimes come from evil? So acts that we would maybe consider to be obviously not nice acts, very, very criminal acts, or things that we're going to talk about in this, do you think that there can be any good from these things? If you really want to, you could put a post with your answers to this and we can start a discussion in your team. That's absolutely fine. It'd be nice to hear from some of you, but have a think about it and see if by the end of this particular lesson you have changed your opinion on this or not. So, question number 1. If I say the term resurrection men, what does that immediately make you think of? So what do you actually think resurrection men did? Think of the word resurrection. What does that kind of tell you about the sort of things that these people might be doing? Now obviously we can't have class discussions, so I'll put you out of your misery on this one and tell you that resurrection men were people who dug up and sold bodies to medical schools around Scotland and the rest of the world for money. So more commonly you might find the term resurrection men being used to refer to body snatchers. People who literally would dig up dead bodies and take them to places where they could sell them for quite a lot of money at this point in time. It becomes a business. Roughly about in the 18th century, middle of the 18th century, people start to work out that it isn't actually a crime to steal the bodies. There is no crime about this. It's not illegal as long as you do not take the materials that the body has. So you're not allowed to take any rings or jewellery or clothing and things like that that a dead body might have been buried with, because that's considered grave robbing and that's illegal. It's theft and you can be prosecuted for that. But the bodies themselves, there is no law against this. And when people start to realise that not only will medical schools pay quite a lot of money for these bodies, and we'll come back to that in a second, but actually you can gain quite a lot of these bodies quite quickly through taking them from graves, it starts to become a very profitable business for some people. But they always would strip the bodies first to make sure that they weren't going to be prosecuted for theft. So the real question is, why bother body snatching? Why would you want to do such a creepy thing? Basically it's because of medical schools at the time. Now in order to gain a degree, every student had to dissect 3 bodies or cadavers across the kind of years that they were studying medicine. And at this point, there is no such thing about people being able to leave their bodies to science or donations of bodies and things like that from places. The only way you could legally get a body is if it was someone who had been executed, and in that way it would only be able to be a body for dissection if it was someone who had actually been executed for murder. These are people that have obviously been hanged, which means that the bodies can sometimes be a bit damaged because obviously it's a very gruesome death for them to get. But it also wasn't the case that there was lots and lots of criminals running around Scotland in this particular point in time, or even the rest of the UK. So it was actually very rare that you would find murder and criminals being hanged for that particular crime. So this meant that the bodies were actually really very rare and difficult to get hold of. But they still needed these bodies in order to actually dissect and to learn about medicine, because it was the easiest and the best way for them to learn about the human anatomy and to actually practice their skills as doctors at this point in time. So there was a need for bodies, which created a market. People would sell. That became a thing. And originally what was happening is we would get bodies into Scotland, into Edinburgh and things like that, because that's where we're talking about just now, but other places as well would ship them in from places like Ireland or things like that, where people maybe had committed crimes or bodies were available. And what they would do is they would put them into barrels, wooden barrels, that were then filled with brine, so salt water, or with brandy, or a mix of both, that would try to preserve the body, and then they would put it onto a ship and send it wherever it was going. Now, if you're in Ireland and you're sending to Scotland, that's not so bad. It takes a couple of weeks, very slow sailing ships, remember, so it wouldn't take just a couple of hours like it does today. But if you're trying to get this body sent to someplace like London or things like that, by the time that you actually get the body there, though the brandy and the brine has preserved it, it won't be in particularly great condition. So this is kind of what they have to put up with. They can't get fresh bodies unless they're very lucky and someone has committed a very horrible crime and been killed. As a result, they would then be executed. But if you were someone that actually had access to a body, medical schools were willing to pay an awful lot of money for it. And sometimes this could be up to 20 times more money than what your annual wage, so whatever you earned for your job in a year, you would be getting 20 times more than that for one body that was being sold to medical schools. So this suddenly becomes something that people who are maybe very poor or living in not so great conditions and maybe have very low paying jobs suddenly realise that they can actually do to try and boost their income. So what they would do is they would go to the graveyards and they would work out that a fresh body would make more money than one that was coming in a barrel. So they would wait until they could see some fresh graves, dig up the head of the dead bodies, put a rope around the head and pull it out of the ground. And then they would take the body away and it would be sold to the medical school. Now the reason that they actually did this is so that it would look like that particular body had been actually hanged. It wasn't just something that they were digging up and bringing in, because there's a lot of obvious moral issues with that and people wouldn't always accept that. So even though it's not illegal, it is very much against quite a lot of faith and religions and things like this at this point in time, which are a really huge part of people's lives, and it's something that they're quite scared of death and the unknown. It's something that people are very, very frightened of at this point, and you don't want to mess with that. It might put people off buying from you. But if you put a rope around the head and pull, it makes it look like that person has actually been hanged, and then you bring the body to the medical school and that's what you claim. You're talking about a point in time where there's not records that are greatly kept of these particular points. Think about in our last lesson, the BBC Bite-Size clip talked about starting to use photographs and things. That was because they wanted to make sure records were much more clear and obvious to help stop these sort of things. But previous to this, you could just write a note to say this was whoever this person was and they had been executed for this crime, and put a date, and that would be it. So they would sell the books to schools. Now, when it suddenly becomes very clear that this is what they're doing, some of them are being caught doing it, or people are actually seeing them do it. In particular in Edinburgh, this was quite a common scene, where you could see body snatchers bringing the bodies in the dead of night to the medical school and things like that. So they started to develop ways to try and fight the body snatchers, to stop them being able to get access to these bodies in the ground. Remember, it's not exactly illegal to do, but they're trying to make it a little bit more difficult. So there's a few methods that they actually used. This would be a really good point to put a heading, definitely, and to make a note, a bullet point list of this different things that they did, because we're going to use this to do a describe question. So one of the first things that they did was they used watchtowers, which if you have access to any sort of graveyards and things like that that are local to you, you might actually be able to go in and see them. They're old sort of watchtowers that are built like this picture, and they would have guards in it who would watch out over the graveyard at night and make sure that there wasn't people in the graveyard that weren't supposed to be. They also replaced coffins with thick iron caskets, like you can see here, that were supposed to be very, very heavy, which meant that body snatchers wouldn't be able to quite easily dig them up, and even if they did, it would make a lot of noise and it would alert someone who could then come. In some graveyards, they put stone slabs over the top of graves, you can see here, and this would prevent them from being able to get in, because in order to actually get into the grave, they would then have to dig up the stone and things like that, which would mean they would have to carry a lot of tools with them, and again they would be quite noisy, quite loud, and they would be caught before they could actually get the body out of the grave. One of the other rules that they put in place was that you weren't allowed to put flowers on gravestones. Now this one seems a bit odd and a bit random, but the reason for this was it tended to be that body snatchers would watch grave sites and graveyards quite closely, and any time they saw fresh flowers being put down on a grave, that tended to tell them that it was quite often a new grave, or if it was a grave that flowers were appearing quite often, then it was maybe not a very long ago death, so they would know that that body was fresh. If, for example, no flowers are getting put down but the grave still looks fresh, they can actually tell that this person, whoever they might be, maybe don't have family members or things that are going to come looking for the grave, and it means that they could probably dig that up without raising an awful lot of suspicion. So by banning flowers altogether, it meant that they couldn't try and use this to tell how fresh a body would potentially be, or which ones they could target without raising any sort of suspicion in family members and things like that. Other things they did, they put iron bars, or sometimes cages, you could make that 2 separate points actually, over graves to try and stop them again getting in. Similar idea to the stone slabs, it would make a lot of noise and it would require tools in order for them to actually get access. The final and probably most obvious thing that they did was they put security guards into these graveyards. So the security guards would patrol at night, and they would have lanterns and things like that, and they would be able to actually see who was in and out of the graveyards. They were also in charge of locking the gates, which wasn't a thing up until this point, so that's something else they did. You could add that as a separate point, locking the gates, to try and stop them coming in, and having specific opening hours where the graveyard was open for visitors or for things to happen, and then closing that and having the guards there on the other times. So these are the 6 most common things that people did to try and prevent body snatchers from getting access to these bodies. Another thing that they did that you can add to your list, if you were very wealthy, so you had an awful lot of money at this point in time, then they started to use underground tombs or mausoleums, like you can see in this picture here, buildings that were designed to house the bodies of their relatives and things like that. It would cost a lot of money to build, but it was very, very secure, and it pretty much guaranteed that the body would not be disturbed. No matter how hard they tried to get into it, someone would always catch them, or it would be very obvious that they had actually done that. And again, they could then be arrested for theft because they were breaking in to this mausoleum or this tomb to try and access the body. So, first task that you're going to do, and you don't have to send this one in on assignments, I just want you to do it in your jotter, is this question. Describe how people tried to stop body snatchers. Now, start a sentence in the blue box for you there. There are many ways that people tried to stop body snatchers, full stop, and then you're looking for 4 points, remember, because describe questions are worth 4 marks, to write out sentences, 4 of them, in your jotters to describe the methods that they used for body snatching. So you might say, for example, there are many ways that people tried to stop body snatchers, full stop. Firstly, one way to prevent body snatchers was that they posted security guards in graveyards, full stop. Another way that they prevented body snatchers was, and then you give another point. So pause the video here and do this question in your jotter. If you've got any questions about it and you're not sure, definitely ask your teacher, but pause here roughly about 15 minutes in and do the question. Okay, so now that you've actually finished the describe question in your jotter, if you haven't done that, please go back and pause the video and do it, or make sure you do it when you finish this video, but it's easier to do it if you pause it so it's fresh in your head. We're moving on to think about more specific body snatchers themselves. Not all of these cadavers, which is the name that we give to bodies used for medical dissection, not all of them actually came from traditional body snatchers who would sneak into graveyards and would steal bodies from graves to sell. As the demand for bodies keeps growing, and these methods that we talked about to prevent them get better, some people decide that it's still a really profitable thing to get involved in, but they can't get access to people any longer in the graveyards, so instead they turn to murder. Instead of digging up the dead bodies, they are going to murder people that they think that they can get away with, because then that way it's easier, they don't have to deal with the graveyards, but also the bodies are always going to be 100% fresh, as long as they're careful with how they commit the crime. Now, interestingly, in Edinburgh, this became one of the most famous cases of these body snatchers turned criminal murderers. And the two that we are looking at are two people called Burke and Hare. They are one of the earliest serial killers that we know about in Scottish history. And they went on doing this particular crime for actually a very long time before they were caught. So to find out more about them, what you're going to do is you're going to use the next couple of slides to complete an investigation sheet. So you can see it in the files tab, and it's attached to your instructions for this week, that there is a CSI Edinburgh sheet. Your findings on, it looks like this. Okay, and you can print it off, or you can open it in your notebook if you're using the notebook in the Teams, or you can open it as a separate Word document. Absolutely fine, it's up to you, whatever you decide to do. You might decide that you're just going to copy it out and fill it in as you go. That's completely fine. So whatever you decide to do with it, stop the video and organise how you're going to fill in the details, and then use the next couple of slides to get the information that you actually need. So these next couple of slides are going to be used to fill in your worksheet. I'm just going to read through each of the cards. If we were back in school, we'd obviously be doing this as a card hunt, but unfortunately we can't do it like that. So I'm just going to read through the information just quite quickly, and you can pause the video and use it to fill it in as you go. But I will go through each different bit so you know definitely what you need to put in, just in case you miss anything or you're not sure. So the first slide here, we have two suspects and two accomplices, people who were involved in the crime. The first one is William Burke. He was born in Ulster in Ireland in 1792, and he came to Scotland, as a lot of people did at this point in time, as a labourer to find work, roughly about 1818. He worked as what we would call a navvy in the canals, so that was someone that built the roads and the canals in Scotland at this point in time, and by this point that we're looking at in 1827, he was living at a lodging house owned by someone called Margaret Laird, who he had met, and he had moved into a house that she owned where people could stay, kind of like renting, like a B&B style thing. Suspect number two is William Hare. He was born in Londonderry, again in Ireland, either in 1792 or in 1804. We don't know exactly, because records and birth records were not particularly great at this point in time. But he emigrated to Scotland just like William Burke did, and he worked on the Union Canal as a navvy, similar to William Burke. And in 1826 he married Margaret Laird, who he had met and fallen in love with, and they lived together and ran the lodging house where William Burke also stayed. Accomplice number one is Margaret, or Maggie Laird, sometimes called Maggie Lode. Again, we don't know exactly, records are a bit spotty at this point in time. She was William Hare's wife, we do know that, and she charged a grand total of £1 as a landlady fee for each of the murder victims. It's also very possible, based on the accounts that we actually have from the time, that she helped to lure the victims into the lodging house. Now, £1 doesn't seem like an awful lot of money, but at that point in time it would be the equivalent of about £100 to £150 a day today, in today's money. So it was a lot of money for her, and that's what she got off of each person that she helped lure into the lodging house that they then killed, or each person that she helped them find to then sell their bodies. The next accomplice is another woman, Helen McDougall. She was the common law wife of William Burke, which meant they weren't legally married, but they did live together and did consider themselves husband and wife. She was from the Falkirk area, and she had met Burke while he was at Maidstone, and they had become romantically involved and moved to Edinburgh together and lived together in the lodging house. We don't know if she was 100% definitely involved in every crime, but we do know that she possibly would have helped to lure the victims to the lodging house, again because it's ran by these two women in theory, so it doesn't look very suspicious. It's quite a relaxed idea that these women are running this nice lodging house that you can go to. The location of the murders is Tanner's Close, which is in the west port of Edinburgh. You can go and see it actually today, obviously once lockdown is lifted. If you are in Edinburgh, you can go and have a wee look. And the victims were killed here and then taken to the Surgeons' Hall, which is in Surgeons Square in Edinburgh, outside the medical school. If you're in Edinburgh and you're having a look at this, there's actually a gold brick in the ground outside the Surgeons' Hall, which is the point of contact where William Hare and William Burke would have taken their victims. According to the records that we have, the number of known victims that these men definitely killed was 16. But it is possible that it was actually up to 30 murders that were committed by both of them before they were caught. The identities of 6 of the victims are unknown. The rest of them, we do actually know who they were. The first body, victim number 1, was sold by Burke and Hare. By accident, they had come across this body, or at least so the story goes. He was an old soldier who was only known by his first name, which was Donald, who was a lodger in the particular house and he was an older man and he'd caught a fever and he had died. When he died, he'd actually owed them £4 in rent, which is roughly about 4 months' rent. And when they found out that actually he was dead, when they opened his room up to try and find out what was going on with him, then they were left with this idea of what they're going to do with the body. It was expensive at this point in time to actually have bodies that you then had to pay to put into either paupers' graves or to have a proper Christian burial, and they didn't have that money, but also he owed them money which they needed to try and recoup. He didn't have a lot of possessions, so they couldn't sell his things to try and get the money that he owed them. And it was just in a general conversation, supposedly, that one of the men, we don't know which one, Burke or Hare, suggested that they should maybe just give the body to the surgeons. It was just up the road from them. Edinburgh was a huge medical school bit, so they were very aware of the fact that bodies were something that people needed and that body snatching did happen in Edinburgh. And the argument was, they don't know what to do with him anyway. If they put him into a pauper's grave, he's probably just going to be body snatched anyway, so why shouldn't they get the money from it? So they took the body to the medical school and they spoke to Dr. Knox, Robert Knox, who was one of the chief surgeons, and they explained the situation to him, and he obviously said they would take the body. And they paid Burke and Hare £7 and 10 shillings, which is roughly about 7 months worth of their general salaries. It's a lot of money for this one body. Another accomplice then that we have that we just mentioned is Dr. Robert Knox. He was born in Edinburgh and was a qualified doctor. He was the one that we know definitely did buy bodies from Burke and Hare for his anatomy lecture, and he was someone that tended to wear purple coats because of blood splatters and things like that during dissections, which is really very gory, but people in Edinburgh knew who he was, and that's going to be important later on. Motives for the crime. Basically, they were roughly paid £7 10 shillings, which is about £731 today's money per body. It could possibly be more than that. It could be up to £10, which is over £1,000 in today's money, if the body was particularly fresh. And as canal workers, they only earned about 2 shillings a day. So the motive there is purely financial gain. They could get so much more money for this, and it seemed very easy after they'd done it once. So victim number 1, we could even argue, was Donald, and that wasn't their fault. But victim number 1 that they actually killed was a man called Joseph the Miller. He was the first actual murder victim. He had also caught a fever or some sort of sickness as a tenant of the lodging house. He was a miller by trade, and when they realised that he was ill, they thought probably a very similar situation might happen. So they plied him with whiskey, which meant they got him very, very, very drunk, and then they suffocated the body. And this was the best method they could use because it meant that they wouldn't have to have marks on the body, which would take away the value of it, and it was a quick and easy thing that they could do to kill the victim. And then they took him to Dr. Knox. Dr. Knox bought him, gave them the money, and then they decided that this was a way that they were going to actually conduct their business. This brings me to victim number 2, Abigail Simpson. She was an elderly lady who had come into Edinburgh to collect her main pension, and she had met Burke at the train station, where he sometimes used to hang out and wait for people to see if he could find potential people. And he had met her and invited her to the lodging house for a drink and for a rest, and she stayed the night with them. The next morning they had gotten her very, very drunk, and they smothered her and took her body again to Dr. Knox. So most of the other victims of Burke and Hare had actually followed the same pattern. Get them very, very drunk, people that are generally unknown coming into Edinburgh, very, very, very drunk at the lodging house, and then smother them and take their bodies to Knox. And they probably would have continued on with this. They were getting a reputation as being the best body snatchers that Scotland actually had. They always managed to get the freshest bodies, and they never seemed to get caught in the graveyards like other body snatchers sometimes had difficulties with. And they probably would have continued had it not been for victims number 15 and 16. Victim number 15 was an 18-year-old man called James Wilson. He was a particularly well-known and quite popular character in the Westport area of Edinburgh because he had been the son of one of the more well-known workers, and the story goes that he'd been kicked in the head by a horse as a young boy and suffered quite traumatic brain injuries, which meant he was never quite what they would have considered normal at that point in time in Victorian Scotland. And he got the very unkind nickname of Daft Jamie because he lost the ability to speak properly. He didn't walk correctly because of injuries and things that had happened to his head and his spine in the kicking. And generally he just acted very much like a very young child. But he was quite well liked and people knew who he was. But Hare saw him wandering kind of near Tanner's Close, near the lodging house, and thought he would be an easy target. It had been a little while since they'd actually managed to get someone, so they thought he'd be an easy target, and they lured him into the lodging house by saying his mother was there. They got him very drunk, and then they smothered him and took the body to Dr. Knox, who did actually recognise the body, and if he hadn't realised or known what Burke and Hare were up to at this point in time, he definitely did at that point. However, he still took the body and didn't actually raise any alarms. It did raise a little bit of suspicion, but not very much. And then we come to victim number 16. Mary, sometimes known as Maggie Docherty, from Ireland. She was murdered on the 31st of October 1828 and was their last victim. They had met her in a tavern, bought her a few drinks, got her very drunk, and Burke had persuaded her to come to the lodging house. As they were actually smothering her, she cried out very loudly that she was being murdered and attracted the attention of two other lodgers, a couple called James and Anne Gray, who were on holiday in Edinburgh and were lodging in Burke's lodging house, and they immediately alerted the police to what they'd heard and the struggles that they had heard, and the body was then traced and located at the medical school, and Robert Knox was obviously questioned, and he explained where he had gotten the body from. This then led to Burke and Hare being arrested. So the period of murders went from roughly November 1827 up to October 1828. They are known as the Burke and Hare murders, but are also sometimes called the Westport murders or the Edinburgh body snatcher murders. Either of these answers would have been fine. Okay, so that's a lot of information. Take a minute to pause the video and either go back and replay bits from the cards, or pause it so you can actually read bits from the cards, or if you've downloaded the cards themselves in the Word document, tend to take a bit of time to fill in your document on your CSI Edinburgh sheet with your findings, and then come back to the video. We're roughly at 31 and say 40 seconds, and we will fill in the findings information there. So pause just now and go back and do that. So hopefully you filled in your information, and we're coming back to the CSI Edinburgh findings. So this crime was also known as the Westport murders, which we have just briefly talked about. It took place roughly between November 1827 and October 1828, so it was a very short period but a lot of victims. Our culprits are William Burke and William Hare, and our information about them is there: when they were born, where they were born, and what they actually did. So we know they were both born in Ireland. It was roughly 1792 and maybe 1804, so same year or just a little bit after for one of them, and they both worked as labourers on the canals. The motive is money. They were paid £7.10 shillings or up to £10 per body, so money is the only motive they actually need. The first body is technically not a murder victim, it's an ex-soldier called Donald, who'd been a tenant and had died owing them the money in rent. Locations that are important: we've got the Surgeons' Hall, which is where they were taken, the bodies were taken there, and we have Tanner's Close in the Westport of Edinburgh, which is where the murders took place. So generally, if I just kind of highlight a wee line, you can see the murders took place here, and the bodies were just taken up the Royal Mile and were taken here. So not a very far distance at all for them to go. The accomplices: Margaret Laird, who was the wife of William Hare and charged the £1 landlady fee for each murder. Helen McDougall, who was possibly involved, we don't really know, but might have been a lure to bring victims into the lodging house. And Dr. Robert Knox, who was the surgeon and teacher of anatomy who bought the bodies. He spent a lot of time afterwards getting a lot of hate from the people of Edinburgh, because it was very clear after Jamie especially that these bodies were being gotten in illegal means, not just through body snatching. So he actually got quite a lot of difficulty after this case was finished. The victims that we know about, there's 16 of them, but it's estimated that this could actually be as much as 30 that we just don't know about. We have Joseph the Miller, who was officially victim number 1, and he was suffocated to death. He was a tenant of Hare's. Victim number 2 is Abigail Simpson, and they got her very drunk and then smothered her. She had been in Edinburgh to collect her pension. Other victims. Victim number 15, the most important one, is James Wilson. He was smothered and suffocated to death, and he was 18 years old. He was popular and well known, and they lured him into the house by saying his mother was there. Probably the key victim, the one that got them caught, is number 16. Again, they plied her with drink, got her very drunk, and smothered her to death. And she's the last known victim because she raised an alarm and people went and actually found her. She was from Ireland and she was murdered on the 31st of October 1828. The couple, James and Anne Gray, are the ones that discovered what was happening to her. So, lots of information then for you to now fill in. If you have printed out the sheet, stick it into your jotter or your notes, or make sure you save it someplace because it's going to be useful for you later on. But the real question is, what actually happened to Burke and Hare? William Burke was hanged, which was the most common punishment for murder. On the 28th of January 1829, he was hanged in Edinburgh's Lawn Market, which was where criminals were actually hanged. It was a spectacle, kind of like going to a cinema or a gig sort of thing today. Lots of people came around to watch criminals being hanged, and because of the kind of really horrible nature of this particular crime, and because of victim number 15, when they actually hanged him, they put the rope around his neck in the wrong place, so that when he dropped, and it was called the hangman's drop for that reason, that it wouldn't actually break his neck and he would suffocate, so the crowd could watch as a kind of macabre, sort of very dark punishment for what he had actually done to his victims as a criminal. So he slowly suffocated to death. We roughly estimate that the crowd that came to watch his death was about 26,000 people. Ironically, because of what he actually did for his crimes in supplying the body, his body as a hanged criminal legally then belonged to the medical school that he had been giving the bodies to. So once he was dead, his body was cut down and given not to Dr. Robert Knox, because by this point he was in trouble too, but to one of the other surgeons to be dissected in the medical school that his victims had gone to. When they were done, they put his body on display in Edinburgh University's anatomy. And that's him here. They don't actually take the skeleton out very often now because it is so old, but that is actually William Burke's skeleton in Edinburgh University. So if you're ever in the Anatomy Museum, you can go and see him, which is creepy, but there he is. The other man, William Hare, didn't actually get punished. They call it turning King's evidence, which means that when he was questioned by police, he agreed to tell them everything that happened, and he blamed Burke entirely, and as a result of this, he was then let go. So he gave evidence against Burke in exchange for his freedom. He then disappears for a little while, out of Edinburgh, maybe out of Scotland altogether, we don't really know, but eventually he comes back, and as an older man, then dies of natural causes. And the image you can see here at the bottom corner is his life mask. This was quite a common thing that people did in the kind of 1800s. When someone died, they would make a plaster cast of their face and they would put it on display if it was a famous person or there was something that they wanted to actually know about them. So that's his life mask. Again, quite creepy, but Dr. Robert Knox was also involved, obviously, in this. He'd received 16 of these subjects, at least, that we know about, and he claimed he supposedly didn't know. But the people of Edinburgh didn't believe him, especially after Jamie, because he was so well known. And Knox claimed he didn't know about these bodies being murder victims, but the people called for him to be hanged alongside both Burke and Hare. When he wasn't, an effigy, which is another word for a model of Knox, was burnt outside his home in protest, and a lot of the other surgeons, including his own students, actually shunned him, which meant his career was pretty much over. He was threatened and he was assaulted on the streets when he tried to walk about in Edinburgh and go to work and things like that. So his life and his career were pretty much over after this, and he had to leave Edinburgh as a result. Okay, so you've been listening really, really well, and hopefully been doing the tasks I've been going, but it's been quite a long PowerPoint so far. So I'm not going to actually play this, but there's a really nice little animated summary of the Burke and Hare story, which is about 10 minutes long. I will put the link to this into the team as well, so you can go and have a look at it, and you can add to any of your notes and things like that, or any questions you've got you can ask your class teacher. But it is a nice wee summary that gives you more information about how this actually happened. So the result then of Burke and Hare's crimes, it actually led to other people trying to do the same thing. Copycat killers who went around the rest of the UK trying to do the same thing, killing people and taking them to sell to medical schools. Probably the most famous of this are the ones called the London Burkers, after obviously William Burke, Tom Williams, John Bishop and James May. Anybody who's a Top Gear fan, not the same James May, different James May, criminal James May, they obviously tried the same sort of thing in about 1831, and they tried to sell their murder victims to people in London. But this was obvious by this point in time that that's what they were doing. So they were caught and they were then tried with murder, and they were also hanged for their copycat killings. So it became clear that body snatching was something that had to actually be dealt with. So Burke and Hare's crimes actually did benefit Scotland in quite a number of ways. It proved that the medical schools across Scotland actually needed bodies, and it also provided these bodies for these medical schools to actually use. So because they actually had access to all of these bodies, it meant that new doctors could understand how the bodies worked. They could study anatomy more easily than they could have if they were waiting for bodies and things. So it did help medicine develop and people to develop their particular skills as doctors. So that's one benefit that happened. Again, a second benefit is that it proved that the medical schools did actually need these bodies because there were some advancements at this point in time. So as a result of this, the government passed an act in 1832 called the Anatomy Act. It was the first time in UK history that people's bodies that were not claimed by relatives, so people who were maybe living by themselves or didn't have family or anything like that, could actually be taken to the medical schools and they could then be dissected for medical purposes. No sinister body snatching and no crime of murder. This act was actually very important for the surgeons. You can see a picture of what it looks like there, but it gave the doctors and the surgeons and their students legal access to cadavers that were unclaimed after death, and it tended to be people that died in hospital or in prisons or in workhouses that could then be studied. And a lot of the time these people were quite ill, and it had been the illness that had killed them, which meant that doctors could then develop a better understanding of why these illnesses killed them or why these particular people actually started to become ill in the first place, which made a lot of steps forward for medicine in general. As for Burke and Hare, they go down in popular culture. Videos, documentaries, films about them, books, poems, things like that start to become a huge part of Scottish history and part of our society. Quite a popular skipping rhyme in Edinburgh, which you can see there as well, is actually still used today in primary schools, which is very, very creepy. But again, it shows what a significant impact that these two men actually had on Scotland and Scottish history as a whole. It's even at the point today where it's become such a legend of Scottish history that it's been used to make comedy films and things like that. So it takes away a little bit from the gruesome nature of it, but it is now part of our heritage, and it is the very first example of true serial killers in UK history. So back to this question that we asked in the beginning. Do you think good can sometimes come from evil? Obviously these acts are criminal and are very, very wrong, but there were some good things that came out of it, and modern medicine acts from the Anatomy Act today in a very similar way, that if it hadn't been for body snatchers, maybe not Burke and Hare themselves, but body snatchers in general, maybe it never would have forced things to develop that way, and maybe medicine would be very different. It doesn't excuse it, certainly, but it maybe makes you think a little bit differently than you did originally. If you do think differently, or you want to debate or argue it, please post in your team and we can have a discussion about this in more detail. So, that's all the information about Burke and Hare. It is a really good point to pause the video, because this would be an end of a period in general, and go away, have a snack, do something else for a wee bit, and then come back to the task that we're going to look at for the week, which is all about judging evidence. So if you are pausing it, do that now, go away and come back and finish this later on. Please don't do all of this in one sitting. It's important that you take regular study breaks, but for this one you can pause it and come back. We are roughly about 46 minutes and 25 seconds in when I'm going to start the next part of the lesson. So judging evidence then. In history, one of the most important skills that you are ever going to learn, and it's useful for both geography, modern studies, it's useful for other subjects and things as well, is how to look at a piece of evidence or a source of information and decide, is this piece of information useful for you? Is it a useful source? And it's a skill that police and things like that and lawyers will use a lot when they're trying to solve a crime or they're trying to actually work out a case. It is a very useful skill for you to actually have. So in history, the way we do this is through a brand new skill that you are looking at this year. Remember, the skills so far in history that you know from first and second year are the describe and explain skills. You also know the comparison and the how fully skills. So for National 5 history, there are 6 skills that you should know, and this is one of the next ones. Okay, how useful. Basically, the point of a how useful question is for you to read a source and discuss how helpful it is. If you were researching a particular topic, how much information does this question actually give you? You need to use the source and your own knowledge, just like a how fully question, but you're not just saying about what the source is telling you, you're saying why what the source is actually telling you is useful, but why other things might be more useful to add in that you also know that that source is not talking about. Every point you make in this particular question, you're linking it back to this idea of why it's useful. You're explaining why what you're talking about or what information you've picked is useful to whoever it is that's reading your answer. It's kind of like you're proving your point. It's always going to be worth 5 marks at National 5. Okay, so there's a few things that you need to do to get those marks. You need to tell us what the source actually tells you, and you need to do this twice, and that gets you 2 marks. You then need to say 2 things that you know that the source is not telling you, or it misses out because it's not a complete source, and that gets you up to 2 marks as well. Your last mark is for when it was actually made. So is it at the time that this was happening, so it's useful because it's a first-hand account, or is it happening after the event, which means it's useful because it's been investigated by lots of people and well researched. Either of these 2 things could be right. The way we remember it is using a mnemonic. So we use the mnemonic cow. How useful are cows? Are the way that we think about it. And this stands for the content, so what the source tells us, the omissions, so what the source misses out, and when the source was written. C-O-W. And to make sure you get all of the marks that you need to do 2 C points, 2 O points and 1 W point for the amount of 5. If you only do one of each, you can still get 3 marks out of 5, but it's a really good idea to try and do 2 when you need it. So, your task for this week then is going to be having a go at this particular type of skill. To do this, I'm going to take you through how to structure your answer a little bit in more detail. So this source, first of all, we have to work out what it's about and where it's from. And to do this, we need information from the source. The first bit I'm actually going to look at is the top of the source and then the bottom. Because this tells me when the source was made and who made it and what the question is actually asking me. So I know now, looking at these 2 highlighted points, that this source is from a newspaper that was published in Edinburgh on the 29th of January in 1829. And I know, based on what we've studied and what we actually know, that this is the place where these murders took place, in Edinburgh. And the 29th of January 1829 is the day after William Burke was hanged for the murders. The other bit in yellow here is the question. So it's saying how useful, so that should be my trigger point, so I know it's now cow is what I'm using to answer this. Is this source in explaining the Burke and Hare case? So how useful is this source telling us what actually happened? There's a nice wee starter sentence down there that we could use if you want one, but we'll come back to that in a second. So we read the source next. So it says, this day, Wednesday 28th January 1829, William Burke was hanged for the murder of Mrs. Docherty. At an early hour, the wide street where the scaffold was set up was crowded and all the windows which had a view were rented out for high prices. Burke was brought from the Calton Hill jail between Tuesday night and Wednesday morning, so early hours of the morning. When he stood on the scaffold, the crowd, to their shame, gave 3 cheers, which were heard at a great distance, so they were happy to see him being hanged. At 8:15, he threw away the handkerchief and was hung. So that means that he just said, that's it, he was ready, because he knew that that was the time. His struggles were long and violent. We saw the people under the scaffold with knives and scissors getting themselves part of the rope. So after he was cut down, people took souvenirs. So this source tells us a lot of information about the Burke and Hare case, but it doesn't tell us everything. So we have to think about, right, what information does it tell us and what information are we missing? So we start by telling about the content. And I would just pick a simple point that I would maybe want to say. So the content of the source is firstly useful because it tells me, and then I've picked a quote, Wednesday the 28th of January 1829, William Burke was hanged for his murder of Mrs. Docherty, which is useful. So I've put my quote, which is useful, is what I'm saying now, as it shows me what happened at the end of the trial and is true information. So I'm saying that this information is true, which is useful, and I'm telling whoever's reading my answer what actually it was that happened. So I've done that once, and that gets me 1 mark out of 5. I now need another point from the source. So I could read the source again, I could take a highlighter, I could underline different bits that tell me some information. So I've already used this bit here. William Burke was hanged for the murder, so we know what he was actually murdered for. The fact it was an early hour and people crowded the streets, I could use that one. The fact he was brought from Calton Jail, I could use that one. I could use this bit here. At 8:15, he threw away the handkerchief and was hung. Obviously, if you're highlighting it, it'll be much better than my highlighting, which just went a bit skew-whiff there, but never mind. So I then decide to write that sentence again, but using a different piece of information. So I say, as our new bit says, the content of the source is secondly useful. So I'm now saying this is my second point, because it tells me at 8:15 he threw away the handkerchief and was hung, which is useful as it tells me what time the hanging took place and is true information. So this gets me 2 marks. I've got 2 points of information that I know is true, and I'm telling the person reading it why it's useful for whoever is studying this bit. Now need to think about what the source is missing. So it tells me about the fact that he had murdered Mrs. Docherty. It tells me that he was in Carlton Hill Jail, and it tells me the day he was hung. It tells me the time he was hung. It tells me that people actually came and tried to get part of the rope. There's lots of information in there. But it doesn't tell me everything about Burke and Hare's case or what they actually did. So, I started by saying, however, the source didn't say anything about, and I pick a point, I'm going to talk about Hare. So it didn't say anything about Hare. This is not so useful, so I'm saying this would be better if it included this, and it doesn't, so it's not so useful because I know that Hare gave evidence and was not hanged for his part in the murders. So I'm saying a point that the source is missing, and then I'm giving a specific piece of information that I am adding in. I'm not just saying, however, the source doesn't say anything about Hare, full stop, moving on. Or it doesn't say anything about Hare, and this is not so useful, full stop, moving on. If it doesn't say it, I need to prove to the person reading it that there is other information that could be added. Because you're assuming that they actually don't know anything about it. So, what you need to do so far is copy out the first 2 points. Feel free to use coloured pens if you want to, the same as I've done on the slide, so you can see the key sentences that you need to use. And what I want you to do is add in the second omission point. So you would write the first 2 red bits and the information that's there, and then our green and blue bit, and then add one of your own. So also the source didn't say anything about, pick something else. So it doesn't say anything about the motives for the murder. This is not so useful because I know that both Burke and Hare did it for the money that Robert Knox would give them. You could have said something like, also the source didn't say anything about Robert Knox. This is not so useful because I know that he was the doctor that bought the bodies from them, even though he might have suspected that they were murder victims. Pick anything that you now know about this topic that this source doesn't tell you and put it into the sentence there. Pause the video and come back to that. The last point we need is our when point, which again we're going to use this bit of information from. It tells me exactly when it was written. So it's from a newspaper published in Edinburgh on the 29th of January 1829. So this means that this source was written the day after William Burke was hanged, because it says in the source that he was hanged on the 28th of January 1929. Use that information to help me here, and I've written this one for you. You can just copy it in. So when the source was created is useful because it was written on, and I would put that in there, the 29th of January 1829, which is useful because I know that is the day after the hanging and means it's a primary source. Now remember, a primary source is one that happens at the time. So kind of like you went to primary school first, that means that it happened first, it was happening at the time, and you're now in secondary school, which means it happens after primary, which is something that happens after the event. It's a good way to remember it. So we're saying this is a primary source, and the fact that it's a primary source, it's useful because it was made by somebody who was actually there and probably saw this hanging firsthand, which means it's more likely to be true because they wouldn't exaggerate it, or they haven't heard other people talking about it and added details. So this is your how useful skill, broken down into the different sections. 2 contents, which is in red, 2 omissions, which are in green, and our 1 when point, which is in purple. For this week, what you need to do for your assignment is copy all of the information that's there and add in the first omission point that is blank and then send it to your teacher. If you're not sure or you're not quite sure what to do, go back and watch it again or message your teacher and ask for a little bit of help and advice. I will also put this in the assignment tab with instructions, so if you're not sure, again, just ask. Well done for all of the hard work that you've put into this lesson, and if you do have any questions or things you want to post, feel free to let your teacher know and we'll help you any way we can. Good luck with the How Useful skill.